Hello and welcome to On Rule Academy. Today we have our course here. It is single sword shot diversity taught by Sir Shatosen of Norcalia. Take it away.
Cool. So as mentioned, I'm Sir Shatosen. Feel free to address me however you want. I'm not picky about it. This is shot diversity class workshop. And so coming out of this class, you should be able to have some more shots in your repertoire, something a little bit practice such that you can apply it on the field next time you fight. Do you guys have any ideas on what, so the format of this class, I don't like lecturing a whole bunch. I like interacting with people. I like talking about some theory, practicing it for a bit, and then getting your perspective and lesson learned from having practiced it. So I'm really interested in a conversation as opposed to a lecture. So let's just start off at a high level. What are your thoughts on what shot diversity is? You have any ideas?
Not throwing the same shots every time.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Not throwing the same shots every time. Yeah. Go for it, Carps.
Wisp, do you want to go?
Did you have your hand raised?
I did. I didn't see that you unmuted your mic though. I'll go. To me, shot diversity sounds like not just having necessarily a wide variety of shots to throw, but knowing when to throw them in what situation.
Awesome. So there's a good time and a place. What about you, Wisp? Did you have any ideas?
Well, other than what's already been said, I guess shot diversity, the reason why it's good is because you want to keep your opponents on their toes. If you throw the same shot every time, it makes you predictable.
That's great and a perfect segue. So shot diversity is probably at least somewhat important. You want to keep your opponent on their toes. Why else might shot diversity be important?
Helps you win.
Great. Helps you win. So with shot diversity, you want to keep your opponent on your toes is a pretty great way to put it. You want to have enough shots in your toolkit that you can handle a variety of situations and opponents. So like somebody with a giant kite shield that covers the entirety of the top half of their body probably isn't going to be open to the same number or types of shots that somebody with a big tower shield that covers maybe the front of their body all the way down to their legs versus somebody with a target shield that they're being really fast with, something that's like a foot in diameter. Carp says one of those kite shields. And as you can see, his shoulders and his arms are pretty dang well protected, but maybe his legs and for creative fighters, his hips are probably more open. Along the way of shot diversity, I also want to talk a bit about power generation, if that's something that's a challenge for you guys. Because there's so few people here, I think that what we'll do is we'll make this really, really targeted and tuned to what'll be useful for you guys and see what we can do. It also seems that for the most part, you guys are solo. Nobody brought a friend to hit. Is that correct? Cool, we're all on the same page there. And then lastly, this is slightly easier with a sword because a sword makes it more obvious the reverse side. So it looks like there's a sword for Beetle. Wisp, what do you have? Club, cool. So we'll just have to pay a little bit more attention to the front edge of a blade versus the back edge of a blade, even though that's not really a thing with having a sword. So one of the prominent theories in shot diversity is you want to be able to threaten four corners. You want to be able to threaten weapon side high, weapon side low, shield side high, and shield side low. Any ideas on why those corners might be important?
It's where the shield ends most often.
Cool. What are your thoughts, Wisp? Saw your hand up.
Basically what Beetle said. Their guard is most likely going to be directed towards you from the front. You got to swing around it.
Sure, absolutely. So the idea of being able to threaten four corners is important because good fighters that realize that you are only throwing towards your weapon side will start to cheat their guard. They'll start to put their shield out. And if you don't have any tools, then that's something that they can just do, and you have no response to it. Most fighters will end up doing that a little bit implicitly or subconsciously. They will, as you throw more to this side, they will transition their guard that way. And if you don't have any ability to throw to the other side and force them to reset their guard, or ideally, actually take a body part, then they're just going to get away with it. So that's specifically why we want to be able to threaten four corners. We want to make it so that they can't cheat their guard towards their weapon, towards their shield, up, nor down. Those are all different ways that you could cheat your guard with a shield. And Carps, you've got a shield. Could you show in the camera what it looks like to cheat your guard weapon side? Good. And then up. And then down. And finally towards shield side. Right? And so you can see in all of these different places, there's a shoulder exposed there. There's a forearm exposed, right? And so there's opportunity, and you want to be able to capitalize on that opportunity. Is that making sense so far? Great. Okay. Let's start talking about some shots. And what I'm going to be really interested in is how comfortable you actually are with those shots. And so when we say comfortable with a shot, you know how to execute it. You can do it fairly quickly. You can do it with appropriate power generation, and you can do it safely for your own body. And that last one turns out to be pretty freaking important when you start looking at fighting for a long time. Doesn't seem all that important initially, but it's really, unfortunately, easy to build bad habits and throwing shots that are good at hurting you. So in my mind, if you're just talking about having a sword, shields aren't involved, the first shot that's easiest, the most basic, is a chop. So a chop will hit with the forward side of the blade, and you're usually going to have the pivot be mostly on the shoulder. And I'm going to shed some clothing so you can see really specifically what parts of me that I'm engaging. So when I throw a chop, for the most part, the pivot's here. The elbow moves very, very little, and I'm aware of the range that I can throw that at, and you should be able to hear it. It's likely coming in with enough force that someone would very likely take it. What are you guys' thoughts so far? Is that something that you're pretty freaking comfortable with? Should we go into mechanics a little bit more? So Wisp, I noticed specifically when you threw the last one, there was a lot of wrist articulation. I would suggest less wrist articulation and more from the shoulder, dropping this down. So this is really into what I was talking about not hurting your own body. So as we take a look at the way that nature has constructed our bodies, you can absolutely throw a shot from the wrist. And it's pretty fast, and it can hit with enough force. The really big question is this joint an appropriate place to generate power from? And so over the duration of years of throwing with just the wrist, that's going to result in challenges for my wrist. Whereas instead, if I'm throwing it from my shoulder, my body is pretty freaking good at doing this, right? So I don't lock the elbow, but for the most part, I keep the angle of my elbow and of my wrist the same. And instead, the power really comes from the shoulder. Is that making sense? You should be able to feel a difference. It probably feels a little bit uncomfortable as you tune a shot that you've been really comfortable with. So the other thing that we want to really keep in mind is how we're posing the rest of our body. So for the most part, you're going to want to be in a fighting stance as opposed to a casual stance, because you're not going to be wanting to throw shots in fighting from here, right? You're going to want to be practicing the stance that you usually bring to a fight, which usually involves one foot forward, another foot slightly back, and a kind of stable stance. And the reason that that's important for things like throwing a chop is if you're just here, you won't get any power generation from your body. It's all coming from, at most, this shoulder outwards. Whereas instead, if we're taking a stance, I can use rotation of my hips to generate quite a bit of force as I try to generate power. What are you guys thinking so far? You're in, Carps.
I have a question about, it's actually very interesting. We get a very good visual of you and where your hand is. And I have a question on when you do the chomp, how your hand is supposed to be. So I've given an example so you can help visualize. So what I'm noticing on a couple of yours is you have ones where your hand, when you throw the chop, comes down in kind of like a circular angle. And then I've seen ones where your hand kind of comes straight down as you're like, does that make sense? So the fist is going like this. And then I've also seen one a bit when you throw when your fist is actually going at kind of like an angle forward. Is there a preference?
Absolutely. So there is, and I think I just wasn't doing a clear enough job of when I'm trying to demonstrate something that's not good. So in those shots, you don't want it to come from the wrist like this. That's going to hurt you eventually. For the most part, what you're going to want is the power generation to be from this shoulder, and you're going to, for the most part, maintain angle of elbow and wrist, at least for power generation. You can use it for articulation, but those are very different things. You don't want to be pushing out with it. You want rotation in. So from my stance here, my chop looks like this. It requires very, very little movement out from my stance in order to execute that strike. Nice, Carps. Beetle, I see your elbow moving a lot. Try making less power come from here and more power come from here. Yeah, good. And I think some of the, yes, much better, awesome. And it looks like Wisp is getting something set up to connect with. Nice, cool, all right. We're seeing some progress already. This is looking already improved. What are you guys' thoughts? Shall we keep working on chops? Shall we move on to something else?
I have a question as far as when that so like they're not always in range for you to throw a chomp. So is the question, can you extend and then throw a shot? Because that would change kind of like the angle of your body when you throw that. So I'm going to give a physical example. So I'm not this close enough to do this. Can I still throw a chop from further away? And am I throwing it the same way for that same shot?
So my recommendation, at least in the way that I fight, is to keep a really tight stance. And any time where you see your body extending out to reach for something usually involves sacrificing something in order to get there. And so I've put a lot of this portion of my body closer to the enemy and outside of something we talk about really frequently, which is a static defense, right? Where you have a shield, and for the most part, core portions of your body are well defended. And so I do not throw shots coming way out like this. Instead, to achieve that same thing, I strongly suggest footwork, right? So let's say that I see an opportunity here on somebody to chop. Instead of reaching for it, what I'll do is I'll take a step and throw it. And that way I can maintain still this good stance that I've got and get the shot that I want instead of having to reach for it and sacrifice, especially the shoulder, to get there. The shoulder, especially on people that aren't super tall, is really, really important. It's one of the easiest ways to die. And when you're committing so much of your vital areas to a shot, good opponents will just block the shot and then kill you because you've come out of stance. Is that making sense? Is that what you were kind of looking for, Carps?
Yeah, and actually doing an example of it right now makes it feel very natural because I did feel kind of exposed throwing that shot specifically. So I'm now trying, correct me if I'm wrong here. So if I wanted to, I could step in and then throw.
And you can also use that step for power generation as well, right? Because you're moving into the shot. You're moving in that direction.
Okay, nice. I feel like I'm bringing my body down a little bit too as I throw it.
For the most part, you won't want to accidentally, that's called a level change. And there's places where that's really, really good, such as throwing hip scoops. For a chop, I wouldn't suggest doing that. I think that's a practice thing to get to a place where you can throw comfortably to that area without bringing your core torso down. So for the most part, in the movement that I'll throw, I don't come here to throw it. Instead, I'll maintain my shoulders to throw. Yo, you're in, Beetle.
So my pell is quite a bit shorter than I am, mostly because it's a shield on a chair.
Totally.
So is a shield, this is a chop, something that you would use more for someone who's about the same height as you, or like slightly different than yours?
Really, really great question. And I think there's kind of two components to the question that you had. How do I use the chop actively in the field? And how do I practice it when the target that I've got is shorter than me? So a couple of thoughts. It's pretty easy to get creative with pells to figure out how to put it up somewhere higher. That's why I suggested in setup that your pell be at about chest level, because it turns out that when you're fighting people, for the most part, what you're interested in is around the chest. You want to kill things that you want to throw shots that can result in kills. And when it's lower, you can only really deal with like thighs and below. So my suggestion for interacting in practice is find a creative way to get that puppy up a little bit higher. But let's say that you don't have the opportunity to, and you want to just go ahead and get some of the movement and the motion down with what you currently have. So I'll do something similar. Give me 1 second. Got a chair, and it's about thigh height, right? So somewhere in that same area. What I do is I pay attention to where I want to generate power, and I want to continue the motion through generating power. So if I was looking to hit this, I would, for the most part, be moving from this shoulder and practicing the motion, that's like a good immediate fix. For longer practice, I really strongly suggest getting something that's higher up. Then let's talk about, well, is the chop something that is really meant for someone that's taller than you? Really great question. So on the pell that we've got, this person, shoulders are just a little bit higher than mine. So it's just a little bit taller. And the shoulders are one of the real sweet spots for chops because you can get a kill. But let's say that they are taller. So my connection is going to be more up here. It gets harder and harder to generate power the higher that you go with a chop. Let's say instead that they're shorter, maybe their chest or their shoulders are more at this height. You can, as long as you stay away from the face, still chop somebody straight in the body. You're going to have to make sure, again, that you're not bringing it through their face, but there's a whole bunch of fighters that are really wide-chested. And so you can, if you pretend a fighter is in between us, throw a chop to their body, clear of their face, or even connect down here, right? So there's a lot of different places that you can throw it as long as you're keeping safety in mind. So again, if people are taller than you, it's going to get harder to throw power with it. You're going to have less room to drop it. But the shoulder and the chest, this area is really what's available for that shot. Any other questions? This is really fantastic. This is exactly the kind of interaction engagement that I'm looking for. Is this helpful so far for you guys? Great. Okay. I think I'm ready to go to the next shot. Does that sound?
I have a quick question about the chop. So I'm thinking about this as like the next step. So I'm thinking of recovery. And is there like a hard parameter on how low you're going to drop your sword when you chop? I've noticed a couple times where after we chop, we have that capability of our sword dropping very low and then our body kind of being exposed. Is there like a limit where you don't want your sword to pass? Maybe your waist or maybe your thigh, or where is that?
Great questions. So when you're in a situation where you throw and end up down here, that's really pretty dangerous for you in terms of getting yourself killed. A guard down here, if a person pushes into my weapon side at all, I'm pretty screwed. If there's a person here in this area, I'm not going to be able to get to a place where I can clear my weapon enough to throw with power, right? So bringing your hand down like this is actually pretty challenged. When I'm throwing my chops, I'm not bringing it that far out of my natural stance, right? My natural stance is here. When I'm throwing, it just comes to here. And that's really a defensive orientation that I've chosen. If you miss your chop, that's about as far as I come, which still is not that far out of position of my natural stance. It takes practice to be able to turn on the brakes for a shot that you've missed and not get yourself in trouble from it being too far. What I found is really helpful is if I am in an emergency situation where my weapon is going to a place that's kind of surprising, instead of fighting it, I'll go ahead and flow with it. So let's say that, man, I really wanted this chop. I'm coming in with everything. I throw here. Instead of trying to fight it here, I'll bring it in a circle out and back to my stance. So from here, shoot, I missed, circle, back up. Recovery from shots is really, really important. Lots of counter fighters are out there where they will wait for you to take a shot and see how that has a negative impact on your static defense, and then capitalize on that opportunity. So Carps, you're asking great stuff.
When you said about like the circle back towards your guard, are you do you do that circle on the outside or on the inside when you recover? So it's like this.
It depends on the situation. For the most part, outside.
Gotcha.
But
that feels the most natural.
if there's somebody that is to my weapon side, maybe that's not safe. You have the opportunity. I'd usually do outside. Cool. All right, let's talk next about every righty's favorite shot, the high cross. You guys have an idea of what a high cross is? Cool, cool. Okay, so why do many people have high cross as their bread and butter? Why is it so prevalent? I think you're muted, Carps.
Go for it, guys. Don't feel, you go first, I'll go second, 100%.
It's not on your weapon side.
Great. That's exactly it. So for the most part, people in the sport are right-handed. And that means in a right-handed versus right-handed matchup, if you're throwing a chop, that's probably towards their shield, which probably isn't going to get them killed. You need to be accessing where there's body parts that are closer to you. High cross. High cross is an overused tool, but having it as something that's practiced and quality is really important, especially over quantity for how often you're throwing it. So I unless you guys are like, man, my high cross is like perfect, I'd like to talk some about it and talk about a lot of form, just like we did with the chop. Is that sounding good? Great. Okay, high cross. So with the high cross, what you're trying to do is get your weapon to the other side of your opponent, and you're looking to do so without significantly jeopardizing your static defense or hurting yourself. What I want you guys to do is very casually and lazily throw your weapon around like this, like you're just relaxing. Now you can feel the body's pretty good at doing this, right? In comparison to like trying to generate power from a wrist, for example, you could probably, let's just come from the hips a little bit harder, you could probably generate like some pretty good power this way, right? Utilizing your wrist in this manner is a really powerful tool for power generation in a way that is, to my experience, going to break you a bunch less than other methods of power generation. So when I'm throwing a high cross, I'm accomplishing a few things. I want some of the power generation to come from rotation of this elbow the same way that we were doing it down here. Elbow rotates down here. Elbow rotates up here. The next thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm not overcommitting my shoulder, right? So if I overcommit my shoulder, it's going to look like this. Now, that's really problematic because you're going to take a bunch of room to get back to your stance. You've opened up a lot more of your body. And so back to my recommendation of how to throw this, I'm not going to overcommit this elbow. I'm going to generate power from turning over the wrist, but I am not bringing this elbow up. The other thing that that's going to do that's really important, that rotation is going to connect with their weapon and move around their weapon into this wrist or into this forearm. And so as you throw a high cross, it's very useful to be able to circumvent the guarding of their wrist and forearm by having that rotation. So what are you guys' thoughts so far? Is that making sense? You're in. Hit it, Wisp.
My elbow feels kind of weird when I do
Okay.
that. Is it like too much power, too much commitment, or is it like something else? So
Listening to your body is really, really important. What I see is you're coming up pretty high as you're throwing it. You're probably used to fighting fighters that are taller than you. And so naturally, you've probably learned in order to throw a high cross, I have to throw it pretty high up here. My recommendation would be listen to your body and really focus on tuning what's going to work to not break or hurt you, right? So you know that you probably want more of your power generation to come from the turning over of that wrist, right? And that you usually fight taller fighters. The other portion is I noticed that you're closer to a pistol grip here, right? As opposed to pommel fighting down here, right? That is another dimension. There's a whole art to how you hold your weapon. It very much, when you're pistol gripping, this pommel feels like it gets in your way sometimes as you're rotating, unless you're pretty comfortable with it. Those are my thoughts on what might be going on there. But I really appreciate that you're listening to your body. Is that helpful? Great. Carps, you're in.
Hey, Wisp, how are you gripping your, not how, but how tightly are you gripping your sword when you throw this? And then how much past your target are you throwing? So like when you're imagining, like I'm hitting them in the chest, are you still going for it? Or like, are you throwing extra just until your sword naturally stops? Or are you stopping your sword?
I'm going until my sword naturally stops. And then for my pistol grip, it's like, I mean, it's pretty loose. Like it comes off the palm of my hand for a little bit.
Personally, I try not to swing, like just let my sword carry on because I overextend my elbow when I do that. So I pick like a target in my mind, and that's when I'm trying to hit, and that's where I'm stopping my sword for this shot. Shots like chops, I'll tend to just keep going sometimes, but for when I'm trying to hit a specific area, I try not to hurt this. So I pick like a target that I'm stopping on, and that might also be contributing to your pain on your elbow. Does that make sense?
I'll play around with it.
Shatosen, have you experienced similar things?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's really down to practice and figuring out what advice from what veteran works for your fighting style and more importantly, your body. Beetle, for throwing against something that's lower, I notice a tendency to not rotate as much. You get to here. That is actually an entirely different shot, more close to what is called a flat wrap. For this, try getting that turnover a little bit more, even on something that is lower than you. You see how I'm generating a lot of power from the rotation of this? Yes. How did that feel? I mean, the shield moved. It looked strong.
Yeah, it was really solid and like it wasn't like overextended.
Nice. Yes, that's the kind of thing that we're looking for. Solid, comfortable movement that works with your body mechanics and generates power. Great. All right. I'm pretty happy with high cross. What are you guys' thoughts? Any experiences? I think that as we're all learning together, sharing some of the experiences or epiphanies or realizations that you have is really, really helpful, because if it dawned on you, it can probably help other people in the room as well.
We're all from similar areas, and other than Beetle, who is very tall. Beetle, you're like 6'3" or so, right? What are you, 6'2"? Beetle's tall.
About 6.
The rest of us in the room here are kind of short, and we do fight very tall people. We have a high percentage of our vets are very tall. So I have also experienced similar things to Wisp here.
Yes, absolutely. And so against taller fighters, One of the things that we'll go over as kind of final notes in the class is how much placement and angle change can really affect the same shot. So for example, me throwing with more force, more rotation here, and I start, this is about the maximum that I would commit this shoulder, is different for me throwing against somebody's arm, which may be more like here. Against taller fighters, I won't be throwing to their forearm way up here. That overexposes my shoulders. Instead, I'll probably throw for their forearm. Sorry, I may have said it wrong. I'm not going to throw for their bicep up here. I'm going to throw for their forearm, which is more accessible to my height down here, right? So when I'm throwing a high cross, it's probably more in this range so that I do not overcommit my body. If you're a taller fighter, you have kind of the opposite opportunity. You can throw comfortably for bicep here. The benefit there is that it's very hard to move a bicep. There's a lot more in this area. If you go ahead and miss, probably gonna hit body at that point. Really great points on how the height of fighters changes this. I want to show one more not to do, mostly because for about 4 years I threw it this way. So the way that I used to throw high cross, and why don't you guys come to the camera, because I'd love for you to be able to see differences in analyzing fighters. This is the way that I used to throw high cross. If I'm looking at you when I throw it, it looked like this. What are you guys' thoughts? What's wrong with that?
Looks like you're overextending your wrist.
Great. So you saw this is way overextended. What else? I'm also hyperextending my elbow. The way that I was throwing that, I was doing this and actually getting the elbow to lock and disappear in here. That, over the course of years of fighting, forced me to learn how to generate power, not with my wrist and not with my elbow, because both of them were screaming at me every single time that I threw the shot. Now, it was pretty wicked fast, and I could still take people's arms, but it hurt me every time to do it. And so that's another consideration that I'd like to start putting on your guys' radar, is that in an ideal situation, you'll be able to fight as long as you want to fight. Taking good care of your body is how you get there. So you guys already have a leg up on me in that you're listening to your body. Wisp, you said, hey, you know what? This feels weird. That's really important. Conversely, Beetle, you had an experience where you did something and it felt good and right. What we're looking for is to have a variety of experiences so you can figure out what does or doesn't feel good, and both of those are valuable. Where it doesn't feel good, maybe that means do that less. Where it does feel good, it feels like it works with your body mechanics, let's do that more. How you guys feeling on high cross? Any other questions, any experiences?
I have one question.
You're in.
Do you have a preference on which foot you put forward when you throw the high cross?
Great question. And again, another one of the notes that I want to talk about kind of at the end of our time. So with all of the shots, it actually matters whether you are shield foot forward or weapon foot forward. For the high cross, what ends up happening is you are able to do different things, whereas for certain shots, it could either be there or not at all. So for example, it's pretty hard to throw a wrap without taking a step with shield foot forward. That's somewhat challenging. With weapon foot forward, it's pretty easy. For the high cross, it ends up being different flavors of a similar thing for me. When I'm shield foot forward, I will throw and I'll use my hips to generate some of that power. But I very rarely actually throw a high cross with shield foot forward, instead opting for what's called a flat wrap. And this is very similar to what you were doing earlier, Beetle. For a flat wrap, I bring the weapon more parallel with it, and I hit their hand here. With the shield foot forward, there's not a lot of reason to overcommit your weapon side shoulder. In fact, that gets you killed pretty easily because already your shield is more close to them. And when you throw that high cross, you're then bringing that other shoulder close to them. Good way to get killed. So for the most part, I throw my high cross weapon foot forward, which ends up being a somewhat more aggressive stance than shield foot forward, if for no other reason than my weapon hand is closer to them. Whereas when I'm shield foot forward, my shield is closer to them. Is that the kind of information you were looking for, Carps?
To me, it feels as if when I'm trying to throw, well, it seems like a risk reward thing. That might be what you mean by when you're saying aggressive too. Is I feel like when I'm throwing my weapon side forward on this shot, I'm definitely exposing my weapon side and vice versa.
Yeah.
Does range change on that? Because I feel as if I could throw like a safer, not as aggressive high cross by changing my distance. Example here is if I were to throw just this, I'm kind of far enough away. But if I were to throw this, I'm far enough away. But if I were to try to go deeper, I'm definitely exposing myself a little bit more.
Sure. So a lot matters there with where you're positioning your body. And I think we're getting a little bit deeper than where I'd like to cover for this. But when it comes to that, there's a couple of things that are in play here. There is the step that you want to take, the range and distance, the portions of our bodies that are in range of each other. But you're absolutely right. As you commit more and more to this side, you open this side up more. In single blue fights, you'll often see people throw and have their offhand covering their body as they throw the high cross because the response is often in this area. At the highest level, any place where you're doing that, you're overcommitting at least somewhat. And at least for the mentality that I bring to fighting, I seek to not overcommit. I seek to, for the most part, stay in my stance and quickly get back to my stance after I've thrown a shot. Is that helpful? Cool.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Let's talk about outside crescent. This is probably the first shot that we may have different terminology on. For years, it's the Norcalian special because it's something that you can throw behind a shield very, very safely. And thus far, we've been able to throw shots that threaten our weapon side high, our shield side high. Now we're going to get into our weapon side low. So bringing it back to those four corners that we're trying to threaten. So an outside crescent, what your weapon is going to do, it's easier if you want to pick up a shield or pretend that you have a shield. You're going to trace the outside of the shield and connect with what you imagine to be their leg. Now, you have some options with how you're connecting, and people with swords are going to feel this more acutely. You can connect either as a chop or with the backside of the blade as a wrap. And the height that you have is going to matter a whole bunch as well. If you're tall, this is probably not going to feel particularly comfortable or practiced because if you're chopping at someone's legs, they're taking your arm for free, right? you're usually throwing higher. If you're short, this is probably going to feel pretty comfortable and practiced because those tall guys are like freaking sequoia trees. They're way up top there and you're going to chop them down from the legs, right? Wisp seems to know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of laughter over there. So what this is a very, very safe shot, right? So if I've got a shield here, I can basically ride. You know what? I'm going to grab a shield. I'll be right back. Hooray, there's a shield right here. Hey, Carps, you recognize this? It's got your name on it on the back.
I made that shield. That was my first positive shield.
All right, so in this outside crescent, I'm going to ride the edge of my shield as I connect. And that's very, very safe. My arm is hidden way the heck behind this shield. And as a result, you can go up to somebody and leg them and then decide what your next move is going to be. The reason that ended up being so prominent in Norcalia is because the average age of Norcalian fighters is for the most part very low, 2 years or less. I've been fighting for 15 years. And if you're fighting against somebody that has 15 years of experience, chances are good that they're probably better than you. It's not a personal thing. They've just invested more time. So we ended up teaching a whole bunch of new fighters how to leg much more veteran opponents and do so in a safe manner so that they don't immediately die. When you throw a high cross against a veteran opponent, a lot of times they will block your high cross, follow your high cross back, and kill you for it. Throwing this outside crescent is more safe in that regard. You're overcommitting much less of your body. Don't get me wrong, veteran fighters are still able to push into you and start taking your shoulders, but comparatively, there's less exposed comparing a high cross to an outside crescent. So that you can see that my high cross is probably here. So there's some opening in here, whereas my outside crescent is here. There's not a lot that this shot takes out of my static defense that gives you opportunities. All right? So let's practice that a little bit. And this is the kind of shot that's going to be really useful for having a lower pell, right? You'll be able to throw this much more effectively than pretending your pell has shoulders if it's not up that high. Beetle, I'm seeing a lot of vertical movement from you. Because you're tall, for this, it's going to change a lot with the verticality. In addition to that vertical movement, what I want you to do is generate power sideways. So you're not trying to chop and skim on the outside. That much better. You feel that? Now, keep your stance while you do it instead of bringing that back leg back. That looks better. Does that feel better? Great.
I have a question.
Hit me.
My question is, when I'm using my shield, well, first of all, it feels very natural to pull my shield over my sword when I do it to block my arm. But the main thing here is my hand supposed to be in front of my shield or behind my shield when I throw it? So am I throwing it like this or am I throwing it like this?
So there's a variety of ways that you can throw this. Especially with a club, you have the option to throw it as a chop, which is going to end up with your elbow really hidden and tucked away behind your shield. That's really good against lefties, for example, who are likely going to be throwing a wrap in return. You want to make sure that arm is tucked away and hidden. You can throw it as a wrap to circumvent their shield and hit them in the knee. And the plane that ends up connecting is much better than the chop for getting around shields, such as with a teardrop. But your hand's gonna have to be a little bit more out for that, and a whole gray area in between. So I end up throwing this outside crescent anywhere from about here with my elbow out as a wrap to here with my elbow in as a chop, depending on how, for the most part, aggressively I'm expecting a response weapon side. If you're moving your shield to cover your hand, then there's a good chance that your shoulders are now open. Any other questions? How's the outside crescent feeling? Good? Cool. All right. Let's talk about stabs next. So hopefully you guys have a stabbing weapon. If you don't connect with anything. It'll wear through your foam and you'll see weapon failure. Stab is the first shot that really matters how you hold the weapon. So in general, I have what's called a modified saber grip. There's an entire class on how to hold weapons. But the important part is that I've got a thumb that's pointing up in some way, but that is protected in a safety perspective, where I'm not like doing this, where weapons can get in between there and break my thumb, right? It's pointing upwards, but it's tucked away, right? And the reason that's important is that your stab is going to go where the thumb points. So when I'm standing and I'm stabbing, and this is going to be another one that's actually pretty easy to do on a shorter pell. You may want to, instead of stabbing the face of something, turn it a little bit so your weapon's perpendicular to your target. You get a little bit more purchase. And your stab is, for the most part, going to be coming from hip rotation. And your thumbs and your weapon is just going to be guiding where that connects. Beetle, it's starting to get away from you. Go ahead and move a little bit closer to it so that you don't have to overextend your body as you're trying to stab it. Nice. That should have felt a little bit better. Carps, there's a lot of action happening in your shoulder and in your elbow. Bring a little bit less of that, right? So instead of from my stance here, all of this movement to get the stab, that's a very, very useful shot to be able to go into a pocket. But the most basic stab is just rotation and letting your arm guide it in. You should be able to put a pretty good amount of power just from that hip rotation.
I tried the other way where I'm just doing a straight jab instead of twisting, and I have found that I actually have a lot of leverage over my opponent that's transferring into power there. I've been moving my pell more doing just the straight stab than the twist, and it's pretty neat.
Yeah, and having the variety and the ability to change that stabbing angle that you're bringing gives a lot of potential to a stab. Any closing thoughts? Any experiences you're having with stabs?
I personally just hadn't felt that much power from a stab just from rotating my hips.
Okay, so are you feeling it now, or is it something that we should talk about more to help you get there?
No, I mean, I think the rotating my hips thing was really a helpful.
Awesome. Tip. Stoked to hear that. You're in, Wisp.
Okay, so I notice a lot of times when I throw a stab, it usually gets deflected somehow, which means I'm not throwing it. I mean, I may have the proper technique, but I may not have the proper timing or the proper situation. So, like, what are some situations where throwing the stab would be useful, where it wouldn't get too easily deflected?
Absolutely. Great question. So a lot of the shots that we've talked about so far are pretty safe, right? Stabbing a little bit less so because you're getting your weapon tip into a place where you can stab the opponent, right? Which means that your weapon is doing less a good job at blocking yourself. So stabs are a little bit challenging in that regard in terms of timing or getting a setup where you can do it effectively. One of the closing notes that I'd like to talk about in this class is finding good situations for you to use new shots, because as we learn these, it's shaking up your body dynamics. And as soon as somebody that's bigger or better than you presses you, you're going to forget all of it, right? So for stabs, I really like to use stabs for ranging Florentine opponents. So if somebody has two swords here and I point my weapon tip at them, implicitly, they're going to feel quite threatened because there's not a shield to deal with it, right? So I point my weapon tip at a Florentiner, and when they come at me, stab their center line. And now they're dead. That goes pretty well. So what you're looking for are the right opportunities to use a stab as opposed to trying to force a stab. And if it's being deflected too easily, that could be one of a number of things. It could be that you're telegraphing the shot. For example, my normal stance is here, and I come to here before I stab. Most people are gonna be like, yeah, that's a stab. That's really easy to deflect, and now I've killed you. It could be that the shot's not actually open. Let's say that I am going against a right-handed fighter and their shield is all over here. That's pretty hard to stab into. There's not a lot of opportunity there, right? For practicing a stab, I'd say one of the ideal situations is against a left-handed fighter with a shield. You can work on your stabs because there's less of a shield there. Don't get me wrong, you're probably going to get a response of a wrap shot, but that's where I found it easier for me to practice stabs, is finding situations where that shot is more open for me to hit overall. Was that somewhat helpful? Do you have additional questions on that?
Go ahead.
No additional questions come to mind. I just work on not telegraphing and then just actually making sure that the shot's open.
Available. Yeah, those are good takeaways. I wish it wasn't COVID times. I would love to work with you one-on-one to get that comfort. Carps, you're in.
So I was thinking about this, especially with the two of them. They're of my realm, and we went over a course one time where we talk about the mid-cross. You guys know what I'm talking about, mid-cross? I've described it as the get the F away from me shot. And I'm seeing, like, as far as situations in which I would use that shot are very similar to the situations where I would use kind of a low stab, where either I'm trying to, like, threaten them, get my range, and if I did hit them, it was like I was probably very easily going to get them. But it's not like a very high reward shot. It's like a situational distancer, or I definitely am going to hit them. Similar to where I would throw just a mid-cross.
Awesome.
Does that make sense to you guys the same way it's clicking to me? Similarly?
Maybe a little medium on that.
Maybe.
Cool. All right, last shot that we're going to talk about is wrap. This is where we start to move from kind of basic shots to what I'd consider intermediary shots. The reason is because the wrap is the first shot that really requires setup or movement. We kind of started dipping our toes in the water with shots that require setup or movement with the stab. As Whip pointed out, you can't just do a stab. Something might happen. You have to find a good opportune time to do it. Wrap shots are very much the case, but they're also very powerful. And I don't mean with how hard you can hit. That's certainly the case. Why do you guys think wrap shots are good?
They usually aim for a spot that's really hard to guard.
Yeah, they're circumventing a shield. You can hit deeper. There's a pretty good chance that if you throw a good wrap, you're gonna kill somebody if they don't successfully block it. Any other thoughts? They're also pretty sneaky. If you're good at a wrap shot, there's a lot of people that'll throw, these big haymakers of a wrap shot where it's coming all the way from back in outer space, all the way through. And maybe you're strong enough to make that happen, but when I throw a wrap shot, that's it. There's very little setup or lead in. For the most part, you get a lot of connection. So let's talk about how to throw a wrap shot. In contrast to the previous ones, you're gonna have to be closer to your target, right? This feels pretty dang close for a chop. I'm up in my target's business at this point. If there's shields here, they're probably touching, right? Let's talk about how we want to generate power on this. On all of our shots, we want to be drawing power from the ground through our knees, through our hips, shoulder, elbow, and out, right? I often think of it like a whip where I start a shot from lower my body, and even just with that little addition of my hips, you can hear the difference, right? Just with the connection of that. Let's talk about where we're generating from. You guys remember this exercise where we found our bodies are pretty good at rolling this over? I want you guys to be nice and loose to roll this shot over, right? This is where I want a good amount of the power to be coming from, is from that rotation. All right, let's do another exercise to get our bodies nice and loose. Away from your pell, what I want you to do is pretend you're this big old raging barbarian. I want you to swing your weapon over your head and then hit the pell. All right, now let's move a little bit closer. Swing weapon over your head and hit the pell. So that turnover that you get, I want to continue seeing that as you get closer. Good. Nice, Beetle. Good, Wisp. Carps, instead of throwing over, you've got a very practiced shot. It's obvious here. What I want you to do is throw out and around. Yes, good. Now commit a little bit less of your body forward when you do it. Nice. All right. So let's try to put it all together. Set up your stance, get out of stance for a little bit. Then back into your stance, pretty close to your target, closer than you think you need to be. And I want you to bring that same energy of coming up and around your head, but less movement. You're going to bring the tip of your weapon in that same circle and then turn over and connect. So again, the tip of your weapon in that same circle and around and connect. Beetle's finding power in it. You like to see it.
I have a question.
You're in, Carps.
What part of the sword am I striking the opponent with when I'm that close?
Question. So the wrap shot has some additional complexity in that the previous shots, for the most part, it hasn't mattered too much where your weapon is connecting. It's usually pretty obvious. You're either using some part of your weapon with a chop, It can be pretty much freaking anywhere, right? You can shot way in here, way high up on the weapon. With the stab, it's obvious because the tip's the only part you can stab with. For a wrap, one of the common challenges that people have is they will hit with short on their weapon, but the power is really in the tip. The tip is where you want to be connecting. And it requires some mechanics in order to connect with the tip at different ranges from you to the opponent. So check this out. Let's say that I'm way back here, and I've had a lot of experience with wrap shots, so I can throw it from here, right? It's pretty obvious that it hits with the tip because I'm kind of at the maximum range of this, right? Now, as I get into my medium range, I can throw the same thing, but by keeping my arm further out, I can hit with that same tip on the enemy, right? So instead of being out here when I turn over, right, I'm going to have more angle in what I connect with by bringing my arm further out outside of my body. And as I get really close, you can see it even more clearly, right? So I'm really close here. If I just threw a wrap without considering what Carps has pointed out, I'd throw it here and it would actually come in with no power, right? Because it's the tip that has that whipping action and a lot of the power. And in fact, most of the time you can hear it. Listen for this. That's my rep if I'm hitting here, right? It doesn't have much power sounding to it. You get kind of this flat sound, right? Whereas instead, if I let my arm stay a little bit more out, you can hear that it connects with force. You guys are doing really well with your form with wraps. I'm seeing a lot of quality. This is, I'm guessing that you guys have thrown wrap shots before. This is not your first time. Okay, little bit medium, cool. So then what I would say is your guys' mechanics are quite good. What you're then looking for is what are the situations, how do I throw a wrap shot to actually make it happen? That's kind of the last step of this wrap shot. So we've noticed that it is quite a bit easier to throw a wrap shot with your weapon foot forward. With your shield foot forward, it's pretty hard. You have to fight a lot of your body mechanics in order to make it happen. The bread and butter way to throw a wrap shot is to take a weapon foot forward step into your opponent and then throw that wrap shot. That will get you into the range that you're looking for. So again, I take a weapon foot forward step, and now I'm closer and can throw that wrap. So at speed from here, unfortunately, I'm injured, so I'm not going to be able to show it. So start off with shield foot forward, and before you even swing at the pell, take the weapon step forward and see if you like where you have landed. Is that the range that you felt comfortable with when we were focusing on the shot? If not, try it again. Take that weapon foot forward step and throw that wrap. Nice. Nice. So that's why wraps often feel more challenging because they do require some setup. You can't just square up to an opponent and throw a wrap shot. You're going to have to do some change in order to make that happen. All right. Any questions, thought, experiences on wrap shots? You're in, Carps.
Beetle, do you have a thought before I go? No.
Cool.
So I am experiencing something that's a little different. Maybe there's some information on that I don't know. So I don't normally use a flat blade. It's something I don't touch. I normally just do Omni Sword, and having to worry about the back of the blade hitting my opponent is definitely something that I have to think about every time.
Yes.
And it's different because I feel like I'm throwing different wraps instead of throwing kind of like flatter wraps. And I've actually found, and it might just be for my pell, a very specific scenario here. My sword is twisting in my hand when I throw it, when I don't hit with the backside. And I actually lose my grip when I throw it like that. Is there any way I can remedy that?
So a lot of swords are oblonged in their handle to help guide and make sure that it's not rotating in your hand. So that's a component to this. But if you're not hitting pretty squarely with the back of the blade, that's the sword telling you that you need to turn over more. You need to get that more committed. So you remember that rotation we've been working on with staying nice and loose here? Yes. So if you connect in that kind of way, it should feel more intuitive and connect in such a way where it's not going to rotate in your hand. And that's specifically why swords are, for the most part, easier to teach wrap shots, because swords force that turnover, whereas with a club, you can throw it more flat. Now, in general, I would say that a flat wrap is probably a more superior wrap. And so Omni blades have an advantage in that regard. But the point is to understand that variance and how much it takes to turn over a sword to get that full rotation, and then decide, oh, you know what? I'm going to throw this more flat.
It's actually very interesting to see it on the flip side, because I like flat wraps a lot, and whenever I teach flat wraps, I actually grab a flat so I can show people how to flat wrap, because it's very obvious which side I'm hitting the opponent with. Of course, we don't hit each other with the flat, but it is a very good point to know exactly where you're hitting your opponent with. In the opposite, it actually feels very weird because I haven't really experienced this, and I appreciate it.
Cool. All right, so I think I'm going to give some closing notes. We've hopefully had a pretty good workshop. The shot diversity that you bring is going to be different versus what you're against. Let's see if I can get my light back. Give me 1 sec. Hey, you, I'm here. Great. So we talked a little bit about the differences between a right-handed fighter, where you might throw high cross more, versus a left-handed fighter where their body is actually over here, where you might throw a wrap more, versus a Florentine fighter that you might consider a stab in their center line. So your shot diversity changes based off of what your opponent is fighting with. Rotation changes quite a bit. We talked a little bit about it with the high cross. There's a difference between me throwing overcommitted here versus me throwing something rotationally that's going to keep me more in stance. The angle that you commit with the weapon with is going to matter. Against legged opponents, throwing a scorpion shot is very, very prominent. Scorpion shot, let's pretend we've got a nice legged opponent here. I'm going to throw up and over to hit them in the back. That's just a wrap shot, but the angle is different. Those same mechanics that I bring to here apply to here. The shot looks and feels quite different. It hits night and day different on the opponent, but the mechanics are very, very similar. Level changes. We talked a little bit about how being tall versus short matters. Let's say that you wanted to get more access to somebody's hip. You can level change, and that fundamentally changes the shot. So what I mean by that is I will choose to sink down a little bit into my stance and throw at a different place. That's very, very fundamentally different than overcommitting your body here, right? In the way that you maintain your stance. Combos and flow matter a whole bunch. So how you transition from shot to shot, a lot of fighters will practice in their pell work how to hit and be able to flow into the next shot, or in reverse. As I transition from corner to corner. Very much, you can get comfortable with combos. One of your shots that you're really comfortable transitioning into another. Your health is, I just can't stress this enough, one of the most important things. Think about your fighting. Think about what you're doing that doesn't feel good or right, that your body is telling you you're doing this wrong, and work on that. Go ask other veteran fighters, how do I do this without breaking myself? It's something I desperately wish I had paid attention to years ago. Most every veteran pays for it in some way. Lastly, we talked about how when somebody that's bigger or better than you presses you, you're probably going to forget all of this. It's just naturally what happens. I really love using new fighters on the field to try things that I'm working out on. And this isn't me being cruel to them. It is likely going to get me more killed more often, and I'm okay with that. I start practicing things I'm trying to mix into my fighting, because that makes fighting against newer fighters valuable for me as well, instead of just blowing through them. So look for opportunities, make opportunities for practicing these things. Hopefully this class was somewhat helpful or important. I'm really open to feedback, so please feel free to give it. And thanks for your time, guys. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Sir Thank you so much, Sir Shatosen, for that class. I found it especially helpful. If we can get maybe like a round of applause for Sir Shatosen, thank you. Oh man. And for those of you at home who watched this video, thank you for sitting through it. I hope you learned a lot. I mean, I know I did. Feel free to take a look at other videos that we have, as well as Shatosen, you have other videos online as well, right, that are recorded for classes?
Yeah, they're scattered all over the place. There's a 3-part class on leadership and field command that I've done in my experiences of commanding a good 60+ person army on the field and training and preparation for that. There's somewhere a 2v1 class for looking at how you teach newer fighters to take on veteran fighters, and veteran fighters how to take on multiple opponents. I'm sure there's a number of classes out there.
I'll find the ones I can, and I'll link them in the event page, as well as when this video gets uploaded. Hopefully I remember to link them in the comments of that video as well. Thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you for attending On Rule Academy. Yeah, thanks. We'll see you guys again.